Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video. Yes, I'm aware today was supposed to be an ADG Mod video, but it's taking longer to put together the content for that video than I anticipated, but trust me, it's going to be worth it as you're all going to be getting a brand new game to play in the process. Now when I realized I didn't have enough time to do the entire thing in just 2 weeks, I decided I'd better drop in a quick filler video rather than delay things, and I felt a good topic to talk about would be something which ties into one of the reasons why I often prefer emulation over real hardware: being able to enhance games. I mean, let's be real here. If you grew up playing NES games or Master System games or anything 8-bit and even some 16-bit stuff, you've likely played a game on one of those systems which ran up against the limitations of the hardware, causing sprites to flicker, gameplay to slow down, or often both. But focusing specifically on the NES, it has a bunch of chips in place to do all of the special graphical stuff it does because, quite frankly, its CPU is very weak. A modified 6502 chip running at a whopping 1.79 megahertz. That means if the CPU starts trying to do too much, it's not going to be able to push out data to the other chips fast enough, and thus things start chugging along. Not to mention, the NES's graphical capabilities are limited to rendering only the first 8 sprites per scan line, meaning if there's more than 8 sprites on a scan line when it's being rendered, some of those sprites simply disappear. Naturally, when you hit these limits, stuff starts flickering, certain on-screen elements might glitch out, things sometimes vanish entirely, and your inputs may even get missed. I assure you, every single one of us growing up in that era often thought, man, I wish the sprites would stop flickering, or this slowdown is really annoying. Well, I'm going to show you all today how to use the Mutant emulator to get rid of these issues with NES games, because it's surprisingly interesting being able to play an NES game without these shortcomings, and almost makes it like you're playing a whole new game entirely. One quick disclaimer before we get into things though, you'll be able to see the slowdown in the video no matter what, but in order to see the flicker, you must be watching at 60 FPS. If you're only watching a 30 FPS stream, the flicker may just look like invisible things or completely solid. But trust me, it's there. Now, let's start with the game which I was playing through recently, which maybe even consider trying these tricks: Mega Man 3. Well, this is actually the first Mega Man game I ever owned, though not the first I ever played, as I'd played 2 first, and when I asked for 2 for Christmas, I got 3 instead because it was brand new and thus the hot new game at the time. Now, naturally, Mega Man 3 is the one in the series I'm most familiar with, but lo and behold, it's also really badly optimized and suffers slowdown in a lot of spots where it doesn't even make sense. Not to mention, the sprite limits are exceeded quite frequently. So, before I start showing you side-by-side footage, here's what you want to adjust in the Mutant emulator's settings. First, go into the Options menu, select Emulation, then go to the Advanced tab. From here, the very first option is to remove the sprite limit, which also has a sub-option to try and detect if this is causing glitches and to turn the limit back on temporarily if this happens. But my experience with all the games I've tested so far is that you can safely leave this secondary option off. Though if you run into any particular games which need this option set, please leave a comment about it and what it's actually doing to help. However, that just gets rid of the 8 sprites per scan line limit. To get rid of slowdown requires a more clever trick, which can be accomplished from the overclocking tab, whereby you can add additional scan lines to be processed before each NMI, or non-maskable interrupt, which in the case of the NES is effectively equivalent to just making it think there's more scan lines per frame than there actually are, which in turn gives the CPU more time to do its stuff on each frame of gameplay, as opposed to just raw overclocking, which would just make everything go faster in general. So now let's check out some side-by-side comparisons of how these changes affect gameplay. Now with Mega Man 3, starting off in Hardman stage as I usually do, right off the bat, these bees no longer flicker and no longer slow things down, which actually makes it easier to hit them because again, one of the problems which can occur when there's slowdown is missed inputs, and Mega Man 3 does indeed have a tendency to miss quick inputs during slowdown, such as trying to quickly tap the fire button for a precision shot, though it'll handle long inputs like walking and jumping high just fine. Top Man stage has these cats you have to fight, and these bots definitely cause some ugly slowdown to occur. But without the slowdown, they go so much faster, not to mention are slightly harder because you have less time to react. But again, your inputs aren't getting missed, so it kinda balances out all the same. A Sparkman has these falling blocks which really slow things down if too many of them come on screen, Gemini Man's water section has tons of enemies, leading to considerable slowdown. Actually, quick tip for Gemini Man's stage. If you miss the 1-up when entering the underground section, the trick to getting Rush Coil onto the ledge at the side so you can jump up to it is to face the platform, call Rush down, and then jump after you've called Rush, as his highest valid landing point is based on how low on the screen Mega Man is as Rush falls to meet him. But once you've used some snakes to chow down on the robot twins, you'll get the Gemini laser, which is really badly optimized. It also happens to be the weapon of choice for Needleman, so let's see what happens if we intentionally miss the first shot of the laser so that it starts bouncing around. Oh yeah, that goes so much slower without these emulation changes. Actually, something else I need to point out, when you defeat one of the boss robots, you get a massive explosion effect. But regardless of your emulation settings, this effect still causes sprite flicker. Something I need to quickly point out is that game developers used all kinds of tricks to keep performance up when sprite limits were being pushed. The changes we've made to the emulation settings only eliminate the 8 sprite per scan line limit, meaning if the game is intentionally coded to turn sprites on and off to avoid hitting limits, or to use the same hardware sprite for 2 different on-screen elements being flip-flopped between on each frame, then no emulation setting in the world is going to make a difference there, since the way the game is coded is what's causing the flicker, not the limitations of the hardware. Here's a better example to demonstrate what's going on with the sprites. Bobble. Right here in the first level, what I can do is just make a whole mess of bubbles and pause the game, as everything is still being rendered while the game is paused. And if we then change the settings while the game is paused, we can see the absolute chaos this would look like with the scan line limits in place. But even with the scan line limits gone, you still see sort of this pattern of bubbles disappearing for just a single frame. So why is that? Well, this is a side effect of what the game's doing to ensure that sprites don't clip each other out of existence. The thing is, the NES only has 64 hardware sprites in total, so no matter what, you can only render that many sprites at a time. But when those sprites are being rendered on a scan line, it's the first 8 in sequence which get drawn to the screen, and once 8 have been rendered, that's it, no more sprites for the scan line. Under normal circumstances, without any additional coding, this would cause sprites further down the chain to completely disappear, not even flicker. The flicker you're seeing on the one side there is not automatic. That's something the developers coded into the game to ensure that no sprite ever disappears entirely. And this effect is accomplished simply by rotating the sprites through the chain. This way, on every frame, every visible sprite's ID is cycling so that if they do start running into the scan line limits, they don't disappear entirely and instead just flicker. And because Bobble didn't quite code this effect perfectly, when you turn off the emulator's scan line limits, you can actually see the cycling taking place as certain bubbles disappear entirely for only single frames at a time, following the exact same sequence of bubbles over and over since they're not moving or changing while the game's paused. In fact, a good way to demonstrate what happens if you don't cycle your sprites can be seen with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2. Now, even the intro here has sprite flickering since it's trying to replicate the size and scale of the arcade sprites to some degree. Now, this game actually has some pretty solid code in place, so it virtually never slows down. But one thing that's interesting about it is if you pause the game, this also pauses the sprite flickering code. So if you pause the game at the right moment, yeah, we just made most of Donnie's sprite disappear from existence. Even going into the boss fight with Rocksteady, you can see there's tons of flickering going on to be able to handle everything that's going on in this scene. Let's go back to dealing with games with slowdown though. Metroid is one of the few first-party NES games which is notorious for this and suffers from slowdown frequently. Plus, anytime it does, the on-screen displays glitch out and show the wrong values for single frames. There's a lot of spots in this game where slowdown is a huge factor, but the fastest I was able to get to, which was absolutely blatant, was the battle with Kraid. Actually, one of the mini Kraids, as these pretty much function just like the real Kraid, but they can be taken out with a single missile. Late NES games frequently have slowdown too, as in order to sell an NES game when the SNES was now a thing, you really had to push the envelope. And Kirby's Adventure has certain power-ups which just completely bog things down when you use them, notably the Spark ability, as well as the Ice ability, which is even worse since it causes ice blocks to form and creates spinning star effects in contact with those newly formed ice blocks. And Contra Force is another late NES game, and one that basically suffers from slowdown as a matter of course, playing slow for the entire game no matter what. But look at this, playing the game with its full intended frame rate is almost like playing an entirely different game. An entirely different and even more difficult game, as if Contra Force itself wasn't hard enough already. So yeah, I wanted to demonstrate how emulation can actually make playing old games a brand new experience in interesting ways, and removing the limitations of the original hardware is one of those ways, and one of the reasons why I enjoy emulation. Being able to play old games on my terms, instead of on the terms of the hardware. I know some people wish they could return to the days of these old games and play them like they were brand new, but quite frankly, I do not miss the hardware troubleshooting, which often went with that old stuff, much more so with computers and consoles or portables, but modern hardware tends to just work a heck of a lot better. Though it's often way harder to troubleshoot when things do go wrong, but that's a whole other can of worms really. Oh, almost forgot. There is one other thing I should point out before signing off. These changes I applied to the MES and emulator settings to make these old NES games play better don't always have the intended effect. And one game I can demonstrate this with is Bugs Bunny Birthday Blowout. Now, me personally, I don't find this game that bad, though I don't consider it a great game by any stretch. But the thing is, this is one of the very few 8-bit titles out there which does not run at 60 FPS. Far from it, the actual typical frame rate fluctuates between 15 and 20, so it's really bad. And I've never been quite sure why it's so bad, but naturally you might be thinking, hey, if I give it more scan lines, that should fix the frame rate. Well, you're half right. You do indeed fix the frame rate, but because the game is timed by frames, you've also effectively tripled the speed the game plays at. Now, funnily enough, it's actually still playable at this speed, but a heck of a lot harder too, as you might imagine. Still, it goes to show how intertwined so much of this is, and that for as simple and basic as this slowdown fix tends to be, not every game is going to handle it right. Anywho, that's all for today's filler video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on the 23rd will be the ADG Mod video I originally intended to put out today, and there's going to be a lot to it, so be sure to stay tuned for it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys. Wait, what? Are you freaking serious? Okay, well, that just happened. I've played through this game probably a dozen times over the years and have never gotten 5 in a row. I didn't even know it awarded 50 extra lives. I mean, really, what even are the odds of... Why can't I have that kind of luck when real money is involved?